Okay, a couple of points that I omitted in that Locke lecture that I do want to emphasize. This won't be a full scale second go round. Um, One really famous feature of Locke's social contract theory is his concept of tacit consent, which I didn't really cover. So one thing you might notice is that, for example, having gone to a constitutional convention, probably, uh, where you emerged from a state of nature by reaching an agreement. Okay, that is, most of us have not explicitly consented to a government, like as adults asked, do we consent to be governed by the government of the United States or wherever we are? Um, so we actually haven't reached a contract. So when Locke says that no person can be put out of a state of natural liberty except by his own consent, um, it seems like most of us are not in that condition because we haven't emerged from the state of nature by reaching a consent, explicit consent. So Locke, and there are hints of this in Hobbes, and probably every social contract theorist needs this, is he says we've tacitly, though not explicitly, consented to be governed by the government of the United States or whatever our government may be. So he says this, this is paragraph 119 on page 377. Every man being, as has been shown, naturally free, and nothing being able to put him into subjection to any earthly power, but only his own consent, it is to be considered what shall be understood to be a sufficient declaration of a man's consent to make him subject to the laws of any government. All right, so what's a sufficient expression of consent to ground the legitimacy of a government? There is a common distinction of an express and a tacit consent, which will concern our present case. Maybe this comes from English common law. Nobody doubts but that an express consent, an explicitly expressed consent of any man entering into any society makes him a perfect member of that society, and subject to that government. The difficulty is what ought to be looked upon as tacit consent, and how far it binds, i.e., how far anyone shall be looked on to have consented and thereby submitted to any government where he has made no expressions of it. And to this I say that every man that has any possessions or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of any government doth thereby give his tacit consent, and is as far forth obliged to obedience to the laws of that government during such enjoyment as anyone under it. Whether this his possession be of land to him and his heirs forever, or a lodging only for a week, or whether it be barely traveling freely on the highway, and in effect it reaches as far as the very being of anyone within the territories of the government. So basically this is going to end up amounting to love it or leave it. If you're here, you have consented tacitly. And if you're enjoying the benefits, like you're traveling safely on the roads because of the police power, or even just because the government is building roads, if you're enjoying the benefits of government, you are tacitly consenting to be governed by that government. Okay. Now, this raises many problems. One of them is that usually in the case of actual contract, tacit consent is not sufficient. And certainly in this kind of tacit consent is not sufficient. So, for example, if I guess this is an example from the philosopher, the legal thinker, Randy Barnett. I break into your house and install a television set, a big screen television set on your wall. You come home and you go like, what the hell? What happened here? But you turn the set on and watch the news or whatever, the game. There's no games left, though, sadly, in the coronavirus era. Now, and then I come in and say, like, okay, you owe me $2,000 for that TV set. I go like, I didn't ask for this. I didn't even consent to you coming and install it. You imposed this TV set upon me. Well, there's no court in the land that's going to rule that that's a valid contract that I've created by slapping a TV set on your wall and you enjoying the benefits of it. So anyway, this doesn't seem to be, it makes the contract not exactly contractual. In fact, I guess I've been doing this for a while, this kind of thing. I don't consent to be governed by the government of the United States. I don't. I do not consent. Yeah, but I have consented anyway, right? Right. So there's no voluntariness to this consent. If the idea is that I have to leave and go into exile at an unbelievable cost to myself, and also put myself under another sovereign power because the whole world is monopolized by governments, that's not a free decision in any sense. And if it's not a free decision, then it's not a valid contract. If it's a contract made under duress, if there's no possibility of not entering into the contract, then it's not a valid contract. So this question of tacit consent raises fundamental problems for social contract theory. The other thing I want to emphasize, and this is a contrast to Hobbes, and it's a movement toward Thoreau, is that Locke says that in certain circumstances, rebellion is justified. So, and this is really the reason that the revolutionary generation in America loved John Locke. There's a systematic argument for the validity of rebellion against the government in certain circumstances. There is no possibility of a legitimate rebellion in Hobbes. Okay? Locke basically argues that when the government becomes hostile to the purposes for which it was formed, it ought to be overthrown. When it becomes tyrannical, it ought to be overthrown. All right. So, for example, he says, this is on paragraph 221 on page 390. There is, therefore, another way whereby governments are dissolved, and that is when the legislative or the prince, either of them, act contrary to their trust. First, the legislative acts contrary to its trust, to the trust reposed in them, when they endeavor to invade the property of the subject and to make themselves or any part of the community masters or arbitrary disposers of the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. All right. And then he argues that we can trust the people only to rebel, basically, when they have good reasons to rebel. That only when life has become intolerable, only when the government has become a greater threat to their lives, liberties, and properties than a state of nature or a rebellion. So, for example, on 391, paragraph 225, secondly, I answer, such revolutions, and you can imagine John Adams reading this, for example, happen not upon every little mismanagement in public affairs. Great mistakes in the ruling part, many wrong and inconvenient laws, and all the slips of human frailty will be borne by people without mutiny or murmur. But if, and this is practically the Declaration of Independence almost quotes this, but if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under and see whither they are going, it is not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was first erected, and without which ancient names and specious forms like the king are so far from being better that they are much worse than the state of nature or pure anarchy. The inconvenience is being all as great and as near, but the remedy farther off or more difficult. So, again, living in an oppressive, tyrannical state is worse than living in anarchy. In anarchy, you have a pretty direct solution. Come together and form a state. Do a social contract. If you're being ruled by a Hitler, by a Pol Pot, you may not have any practical solutions. You're much worse off in an oppressive ruling situation than in a state of anarchy. And that justifies a rebellion in certain circumstances. Right? Trust the people to know when they ought to resist. And that's a very, very radical position in the 17th century, actually. Not a lot of people are putting that forward, the right of rebellion. But we'll see how that develops. Number 2 is over.